What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Week 6 fantasy video. This time we got the wide receiver stardom sit-em. Now, first up, we have the Thursday night football matchup between the Chiefs and the Broncos. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Courtland Sutton. He's Russ's favorite target. He's only really had one very rough week. The Broncos should be really down in this game too, I'm predicting, so they should have to throw the ball more. But I'm only starting him if you have absolutely no other good options left. As for the Kansas City wide receivers, there is no true number one receiver here. It could be Rice one week, it could be Watson the next, Tony after that. I would just avoid the entire wide receiver core here. And Jerry Jeudy is also going to be a sit. He's targeted 24 times in 4 weeks. He's the number 61 fantasy wide receiver. No finishes above wide receiver 29. He needs to prove himself until he's worthy of being started, so he should be set. Next up, we have the Titans and the Ravens in London. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Zay Flowers. He's been targeted 10 times in 3 out of the 5 games. That's pretty good for a rookie. The Titans allow the 8th most points per game to wide receivers with 40.84. He's one of Lamar's favorite targets, probably number 2 behind Mark Andrews, and he creates good separation from defenders, which allows for more opportunities to receive the ball. As for DeAndre Hopkins, he's finally finding his footing in this offense, and Henry is being limited. Derrick Henry's not really being as successful in this offense, so that should provide more opportunities for DeAndre Hopkins to shine. And the Ravens allow about 34.68 points per game to wide receivers, just about the league average, or give or take, so DeAndre Hopkins could still have a really good matchup here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start them both. Alright, up next we have the Falcons versus the Commanders. Pretty shocking here. I'm going to start Drake London. I got the same reaction when I started Desmond Ridder, but I'm going to start Drake London. Washington allows the 5th most points per game to wide receivers with 44.38. They've allowed 9 touchdowns to receivers, the most in the NFL, and the 2nd most receiving yards to wide receivers with 1,032. It's possibly his best matchup all season. He played pretty well last week, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start Drake London. As for Terry McLaurin, he's struggling this year. The Falcons allow the 5th least points per game to receivers with just a little bit over 27. They've allowed the 4th least receiving yards with 605, and he only has one finish better than wide receiver 26. For that reason, Terry McLaurin just needs to be sat. A divisional matchup between the Bears and the Vikings is up next. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Jordan Addison. He's going to be the guy with Jefferson sidelined for multiple weeks. He scored 15 points or more in 3 out of his 5 games so far, and that's as a wide receiver too. The Bears have allowed 6 touchdowns to receivers, tied 3rd most, and this is a pass-first offense. He has a shaky Bears defense as his matchup. He should feast. As for DJ Moore, the Vikings have allowed the 3rd most points per game to wide receivers with 47.2. The Vikings have allowed 6 touchdowns, the same as the Bears, tied for the 3rd most, and they've allowed the most receiving yards to wide receivers with 1,048. He's coming off of his best game probably ever, 8 catch, 230 yards, 3 touchdowns. You're going to want to start DJ Moore and not think about it twice. Next up, we have the Bengals versus the Seahawks. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start DK Metcalf. He's the number 1 receiver for the Seahawks by far. He has no weeks under 12 points, no weeks worse than wide receiver 18. He's consistently the reliable guy in that Seahawks passing offense. You're going to want to start him. Jamar Chase, that's a definite start. We all know that. He's coming off of a 15 catch, 192 yard, 3 touchdown game, and it's proven that he is locked in as a wide receiver 1 going forward. Along with that, the Seahawks give up the most points per game to wide receivers with just above 48, so Jamar Chase a definite start. As for Tyler Lockett, he's going to be sat. He's inconsistent, 3 finishes of wide receiver 42 or worse. The Bengals allow the 9th least points per game to wide receivers with 31.28, and they've allowed the 5th least receptions per game to wide receivers, so Tyler Lockett, not a good fit here. I would sit him. Next up, we have the Browns versus the 49ers, and I know what you're thinking. This looks a little wonky, but I couldn't decide whether or not to start or sit the 49ers receivers because it's just kind of in the middle. They're solid choices week to week, but they can vary in range. Some weeks they're top 10, some weeks they're 30 or worse. So it's like a hit or miss for both Ayuk and Debo. and that's why it's kind of in the middle. The Browns also allow the least points per game to wide receivers with 16.98, and have allowed the least yards and least touchdowns to wide receivers. So while they might seem like good options, they could very well just kind of crap the bed, and that's why it's in the middle for me. As for the Browns wide receivers, there's an uncertainty at quarterback, which makes for inconsistent wide receiver play. If Watson doesn't play, the wide receivers don't really get much volume, and I show that by showing that Elijah Moore and Amari Cooper last week with Dorian Thompson Robinson at quarterback combined for 3 catches and 36 yards. So because of that, I'm sitting the wide receivers for the Browns. The Texans versus the Saints are up next, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start Nico Collins. I was very much on the fence about this because I know that the Saints defense can be pretty stingy, but I'm going to lean towards starting him. He's the number 1 receiver for the Texans, number 11 fantasy. He has a couple mixed bag performances, 2 top 5 finishes, but 2 wide receiver 53 or worse finishes. The Saints limited New England to 132 passing yards last week, but I am leaning start. There are better options out there, however. Nico Collins is still a good option, but there are definitely better options. As for the Saints wide receivers, Texans allow the 4th least points per game to wide receivers with 25.6. Olave has had 3 catches for 16 yards total over the last 2 games. And the Texans have only allowed 1 touchdown to wide receivers, best in the NFL. Carr has some inconsistencies. Saints wide receivers should be sad for now until they can figure out what they're doing in that offense with the wide receivers and make it more consistent. The Jaguars versus the Colts are up next, a rematch from Week 1. You're going to want to start Michael Pittman, Calvin Ridley, and Christian Kirk here. Michael Pittman has been targeted 11 times with Minshew as his quarterback in Week 3. He's a solid wide receiver 2 versus the Jaguars, who give up 36.5 points per game to the receivers. He's relying on receptions, though, to be successful, so that's a little bit of a downside. As for Calvin Ridley, he bounced back really good last week with 7 catches for 122 yards. He had 8 catches for 101 yards and a touchdown versus the Colts in Week 1, and the Colts allowed the 9th most points per game to wide receivers with just a little above 39. For Christian Kirk, he's one of the most consistent flex spot / wide receiver 2 options this year. He's got 40 targets, for 29 catches, 326 yards since Week 2, which is good enough to be the 20th fantasy wide receiver. So he's a pretty solid option. As for the sits, Josh Downs is going to be sat for me. I'd like to see a little bit more of a great performance, like a couple more weeks, maybe even just this 1 week, before starting him. He did get 8 catches on 12 targets from Minshew in Week 3, but again, I'd like to see a larger sample size instead of just plugging him in. The Dolphins versus the Panthers are up next. You're going to want to start Adam Thielen. Miami allows the 10th most points per game to wide receivers with just under 38. They've also allowed the 7th most total receptions with 74. Adam Thielen has 3 top 16 finishes in 4 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, he has 44 targets, 36 catches, 382 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Number 10 fantasy wide receiver this year, so Adam Thielen is starting to cook, and he's getting hot. You want to start him. Tyreek Hill, it's simple. He's the number 1 fantasy wide receiver, and he has the number 1 most points in the NFL. For fantasy, you're going to want to start him. There's nothing else to really say. As for Jalen Waddle, the Panthers allow the 7th least points per game to wide receivers with a little bit under 28, and Waddle has no finishes better than wide receiver 20. That's not great. They also allow the 4th least total catches to wide receivers, so Waddle might not have as many opportunities, so for that reason, I'm going to sit him. The Raiders versus the Patriots are up next, and this is honestly such an ugly matchup. But you're going to want to start Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers. Devontae is the wide receiver 9 in fantasy, and he's the favorite target in Las Vegas by all means. He's struggling to produce consistently, but he's too good not to start. That's pretty simple. Jacoby Myers, he's actually been shockingly really good in fantasy this year. With Jimmy G as his quarterback, he has 32 targets for 23 catches, 241 yards, and 3 touchdowns. That's good enough to be a solid wide receiver 2 and flex if Jimmy G is healthy. As for the Patriots wide receivers, in my opinion, this is the worst team in football. Their best wide receiver is currently wide receiver 39, and everybody's worse than that. You should just avoid their entire offense by any means necessary. Just do not include them on your roster. The Jets versus the Eagles are up next, and you're going to go ahead and start A.J. Brown. He's the number 8 fantasy wide receiver. Over the last 3 weeks, he has 35 targets, 24 catches, 2 touchdowns, and a couple hundred yards. He's finally finding consistent rhythm, which means that he should be a wide receiver 1 moving forward, and he's a definite start. As for Garrett Wilson, this is all about his potential ceiling and the matchup that he has more than what he's done this season. The Eagles have allowed the 4th most points per game to wide receivers with 46.5, and they've given up the 3rd most receptions and 2nd most touchdowns to wide receivers. So he has a really good matchup, and for that reason, he should be started. As for Devontae Smith, I'm actually going to sit Devontae Smith. The Jets allow the 2nd least points per game to wide receivers with just a little above 23. They're really getting after those receivers. And Devontae Smith hasn't really done anything this year. He's the wide receiver 26 in fantasy. He has 3 games of 4 catches or less and 3 finishes of wide receiver 25 or worse. Because he isn't consistent, he's got to be sat here. I can't start him knowing all of these stats. Another divisional matchup, this time out of the NFC West between the Cardinals and the Rams. You're going to want to start all of the receivers here. Puka and Kupp are a very good duo. They're a very solid start. Arizona allows the 7th most points per game to wide receivers with 40.84. They're both mainstays in this offense, capable of grabbing 8 receptions with 10 targets per game, even with multiple mouths to feed, and they rack up that yardage, and these are the most likely 2 to get touchdowns in this offense. As for Marquise Brown, he's a solid wide receiver 2 option. He has scored at least 16 points in the last 4 weeks each, but the Rams do allow the 6th least points per game to wide receivers with just 27. He does have 9 targets per game over the last 4 weeks and 3 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks, so he has a ton of volume and a ton of upside, so I would start him for that reason. Buccaneers versus Lions is next, and that should be such a fun matchup between these two teams. We're going to go ahead and we're going to start Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's probable for week 6. He's got average 9 targets, 6 receptions, 80 yards per game over the last 4 weeks with 3 top 15 finishes. The Bucs allow 38.65 points per game to the wide receiver position, about the league average. So he should be started. He's definitely that guy in Detroit. Go ahead and start him. As for Mike Evans, he's got 9 targets and 6 receptions for 100 yards and a touchdown average in the full 3 games that he's played. He's the number 15 fantasy wide receiver, missing almost 1 full game and not playing in week 5. So he's really performing well this year. And the Lions allowed the 11th most points per game to the wide receiver position with 37.28. As for Chris Godwin, you're going to want to sit him. The reason being his production diminishes in this offense when Evans is playing. He's wide receiver 40 or worse, averaging 50 yards per game on 6 targets and 4 receptions when Evans is playing, as opposed to his really outstanding performance last week of over 100 yards, 8 catches, or whatever it was, when he wasn't. So because Evans is playing, you're going to want to sit Godwin. One of the battles for New York here between the Bills and the Giants, we're going to want to start the wide receivers from the Bills, including Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis is currently wide receiver 14 in fantasy. He's finished with over 10 points in each of his last 4 games. The Giants allow the 12th most points per game to wide receivers with 37.1. He's a good flex play if you have players on bye. He's getting solid usage still in that offense, so I would start him. As for Stephon Diggs, he's the wide receiver 2 in fantasy. He's got over 100 yards in 4 out of his last 5 games. He's a must-start by default. There's no way you're not starting Stephon Diggs. As for the Giants wide receivers, Tyrod Taylor's most likely to start at quarterback, but it doesn't really matter because you don't know what to expect from this offense anyway. The Giants wide receiver performances are so poor that you should just sit their entire offense except for Darren Waller. That should be the only guy you ever even consider playing on this offense. And last but not least, we have the Monday Night Football game between the Chargers and the Cowboys. You're going to want to start both of the top receivers in these games. CeeDee Lamb, for sure. The Chargers give up the second most points per game to wide receivers with 47.35. He's currently the number 16 fantasy wide receiver. He has a really low floor, though, because Dak is so inconsistent, but he's too good, and he has too good of a matchup not to start him here. As for Keenan Allen, he has 2 weeks as wide receiver 1. The Cowboys do allow the third least points per game to wide receivers with 23.6. However, he's easily a top 10 fantasy wide receiver option for the rest of the season, and he's easily the number 1 target in this offense. You can't really afford to sit him because he's just going to get so many looks from Justin Herbert. And that's going to do it for this week's Stardom Sit-em for the wide receiver position. If you guys like this video and you want to see more videos like this, make sure you like and smash that subscribe button. Comment if you have any recommendations or if you have any questions for me about fantasy advice. I'd love to answer them, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.